The deadline arrived at 6 in the morning, Greenwich Mean Time. Ambassador Keth Voran waited on his bridge for the humans to transmit their surrender. He had prepared a gracious speech. He would tell them their submission was wise. He would explain the benefits of serving the hegemony. He was looking forward to it. At 1 minute past 6, humanity gave its answer. The first attack came not from missiles or bombs, but from something the Valorians had never seen before. Across Earth, thousands of computers launched a coordinated assault on the alien ships. Human hackers had spent the last 12 hours studying the signals that passed between the Valorian vessels. They did not understand the alien language. They did not need to. They understood patterns. They understood systems. And they understood how to break things. The Valorians had never encountered digital warfare. Their species had developed technology differently. They had never needed to protect their systems from attack because no species had ever thought to attack them this way. Within minutes, the support ships around Keth Voran's flagship began behaving strangely. Navigation systems reported impossible locations. Communication channels filled with garbage data. Weapons locked themselves and refused to unlock. Keth Voran stared at his tactical display in confusion. Red warning lights flashed across the bridge. His officers shouted at each other, trying to understand what was happening. Then the second wave hit. Every ground-based laser on the daylight side of Earth fired at the same moment. These weapons had been built to shoot down missiles during the old wars between human nations. They were not powerful enough to destroy the alien ships, but they were powerful enough to blind them. Sensors across the Valorian fleet burned out under the concentrated assault. Ships that had been watching everything suddenly could see nothing. Commanders who had felt safe in their advanced vessels suddenly felt very exposed. While the Valorians struggled to restore their vision, a third attack was already on its way. Thousands of missiles launched from silos and submarines across the planet. These were not nuclear weapons. They were anti-satellite missiles designed to destroy objects in low orbit. They had been modified in the last 12 hours to fly higher and faster than ever before. The missiles did not try to destroy the alien ships. Their shields were too strong for that. Instead, they exploded in carefully calculated patterns, filling space with clouds of debris and shrapnel. The Valorian ships had to move or be shredded by millions of tiny fragments. Keth Voran watched his beautiful formation fall apart. Support ships scattered in all directions. His dreadnoughts moved to avoid the debris clouds. The perfect geometric pattern his fleet had held for thousands of conquests dissolved into chaos. He felt something cold growing in his chest. This was not how first contact was supposed to go. Primitive species did not attack. They did not have plans. They certainly did not coordinate attacks across an entire planet with perfect timing. Keth Voran made a decision. These humans needed to learn respect. He ordered a demonstration strike. His weapons officer selected a target. A large city on the subcontinent called India. Millions of humans lived there. When they died, the rest would understand the price of defiance. The flagship's main weapon charged and fired. Rods of ultra-dense metal, accelerated to incredible speeds, fell toward the city called Mumbai. They never arrived. General Chun watched the tracking data on her screens. Her analysts had predicted this response. They knew the aliens would try to punish humanity for fighting back. They had prepared for it. Modified ballistic missiles launched from submarines in the Indian Ocean intercepted the alien projectiles in the upper atmosphere. The explosions were not meant to destroy the rods. That was impossible. Instead, they were precisely shaped to deflect them, to push them off course, to turn a deadly attack into a spectacular but harmless light show. Across Mumbai, millions of people watched the sky light up with fire. They felt the ground shake from distant explosions. But the city survived. Every building still stood. Every person still breathed. On his bridge, Kethvorin could not believe what he was seeing. His weapons officer confirmed it 3 times. The strike had failed. The primitives had somehow knocked his projectiles off course. His communications officer reported an incoming transmission from the planet. Kethvorin ordered it played on the main screen. A human female appeared. She wore a uniform covered in symbols Kethvorin did not recognize. Her face was hard and her eyes were cold. She spoke only 5 words, and even though they were in a human language, the translation was perfect. That was your one warning. The transmission ended. Kethvorin stood in silence. Around him, his officers waited for orders. His tactical display showed his fleet in disarray. His communications were compromised. His weapons had proven ineffective. And somewhere below, an entire planet full of creatures was watching him fail. For the first time in 300 years of conquest, Kethvorin did not know what to do. He thought about ordering a full assault. He could crack the planet's crust if he wanted to. He could burn the atmosphere. He could destroy everything. But something stopped him dead. It was the look in that human female's eyes. He had seen fear before. He had seen hatred. He had seen desperation. But he had never seen what he saw in her eyes. She was not afraid of him. She was not desperate. She looked at him the way a predator looks at prey. She looked at him like she knew something he did not. Kethvorin made a decision that would change the history of the galaxy. He ordered his fleet to pull back, not retreat. Not yet, just pull back. He needed time to think. He needed to understand what he was dealing with. On Earth, General Chun allowed herself a small smile. The first battle was won, but she knew this was only the beginning. The aliens would return with more ships. They would return with more weapons. They would return angry. She looked at the reports coming in from around the world. Damage was minimal. Casualties were light. Every system was still functioning. Humanity had just done something no other species had ever done. They had fought back against the hegemony. They had drawn blood. Now they needed to prepare for the real war. The Valorian hegemony had been conquering worlds for 8,000 years. They had a simple method that always worked. They would arrive at a new planet with their massive ships. They would tell the species living there to surrender, and the species would surrender. It was simple mathematics. No primitive civilization could fight against ships that bent gravity itself. Ambassador Kethvorin stood on the bridge of his flagship and looked down at the blue planet below. It was a pretty world. Oceans covered most of its surface. Green and brown continents spread across the rest. Radio signals leaked from this world in all directions, full of strange languages and stranger music. His officers had already done their work. This species called themselves humans. They had only recently discovered nuclear power. They had not yet left their own solar system. By hegemony standards, they were barely more than animals. Kethvorin smiled. This would be easy. He ordered his communications officer to broadcast a standard message. His words were translated into every major human language and sent to every receiver on the planet. The message was simple. Surrender your world. Accept our rule. Provide tribute. Do these things and you will be allowed to live. The humans asked for 48 hours to consider the offer. Kethvorin found this amusing. Most species begged. Most species cried. These creatures wanted to negotiate. He admired their spirit, even if it was foolish. He granted them 24 hours instead. He was not unkind, but he was not patient either. What Kethvorin did not know was that he had made a terrible mistake. He had assumed the humans were like every other species the hegemony had conquered. He assumed they would be afraid. He assumed they would be divided. He assumed they would see his ships and lose all hope. He was wrong about all of these things. The The moment his message reached Earth, something remarkable happened. Enemies became friends. Nations that had pointed nuclear weapons at each other for decades suddenly found common ground. Generals who had spent their entire careers planning wars against each other picked up phones and started planning together. In Washington, the American president sat down with his military commanders. In Moscow, the Russian leader did the same. In Beijing, in London, in New Delhi, in every capital across the world, the same conversations happened at the same time. The aliens wanted humanity to kneel. Humanity had never been very good at kneeling. Deep beneath mountains and oceans, nuclear arsenals were retargeted. Satellites were reprogrammed. Soldiers who had been training for wars that would never happen suddenly had a new enemy to focus on. And in secret bunkers built during a colder war, old plans were dusted off and updated. The humans had never planned for aliens, but they had planned for everything else. They had plans for invasions from every direction. They had plans for wars that would destroy the world. They had plans for enemies that outnumbered them, outgunned them, and outmatched them in every way. Now they had a real enemy, and they had 24 hours. General Sarah Chun had not slept in 36 hours. She stood in the command center beneath the Rocky Mountains and watched screens filled with data about the alien ships. Her analysts had been working nonstop since the first transmission. They had learned more in one day than most scientists learned in a lifetime. The alien ships used some kind of gravity manipulation technology. Humanity did not have anything like it. But humanity did have nuclear weapons. Lots of nuclear weapons. And they had missiles that could reach orbit. More importantly, humanity had something the aliens clearly did not expect. They had experience with war. Chun looked at the reports from every nation. Chinese carriers were moving into position. Russian nuclear submarines had gone silent and deep. American stealth bombers were loading special payloads. British and French forces were coordinating with everyone else. Even old enemies had put aside their differences. The aliens thought they were dealing with primitives. They had no idea that humans had spent their entire history fighting each other. Every generation had known war. Every nation had armies. Every child learned about battles and heroes and the terrible price of freedom. While the hegemony had conquered through technology alone, humans had turned warfare into a science, into an art, into something that lived in their blood and bones. Ambassador Keth Vorn watched the planet below and waited for their surrender. He expected crying. He expected begging. He expected the usual desperate attempts to negotiate better terms. Instead, he received silence. His communications officer reported no response from the human governments. No pleas for mercy. No offers of tribute. Just silence, spreading across every channel they had used to contact the planet. Keth Vorn felt a small flicker of unease. This was not normal behavior for a conquered species. They should be panicking. They should be trying to save themselves. Instead, they had simply gone quiet. He ordered his officers to scan the planet more carefully. What they found confused him. The humans were moving. Millions of them were moving. Military vehicles flowed along roads like blood through veins. Ships that floated on water were leaving their ports. Flying machines were taking off from hidden bases. And deep underground, in places his scanners could barely reach, something was happening. His tactical officer suggested they should attack immediately. Destroy a few cities. Show the humans what real power looked like. Keth Vorn considered this, but decided to wait. He was curious. He wanted to see what these primitive creatures thought they could do against ships that had conquered 1,000 worlds. On Earth, General Chun looked at the countdown timer on her screen. 12 hours remained. 12 hours until the aliens expected an answer. She picked up a phone that connected her to every military command center on the planet. Her voice was calm and steady. They would not surrender, she told them. They would not beg. They would not kneel before creatures who thought they could take their world without a fight. When the deadline came, humanity would give its answer. And that answer would be written in fire in bunkers across the globe. Men and women checked their weapons. Pilots ran through final checklists. Submarine commanders verified their targets. And ordinary people looked up at the sky and waited. They were afraid. Of course they were afraid. But fear had never stopped humans before. Their history was written in the blood of those who had faced impossible odds and refused to quit. The aliens had given them 24 hours. They only needed 12. When the sun rose on the last free day of humanity, every weapon on Earth was pointed at the sky. Fleet Commander HFY arrived 3 weeks after Ambassador Kethvoran's humiliation. She brought the full power of the hegemony's 3rd Expeditionary Force, 40 dreadnoughts, 200 cruisers, enough firepower to crack a planet in half. She studied the reports from Kethvoran's failed mission with cold precision. The humans had been clever. They had used tricks and deception. They had exploited weaknesses the hegemony had never known existed. But they were still primitives. They still used chemical propulsion and nuclear weapons. They had no shields. They had no gravity manipulation. They had nothing that should frighten a civilization that had ruled stars for 8,000 years. HFY believed the problem had been approach. Kethvoran had been too gentle. He had given the humans time to organize. He had allowed them to strike first. She would not make the same mistake. Her fleet would enter orbit. Her ships would begin bombardment immediately. No warnings. No ultimatums. Just fire until nothing remained. What HFY did not understand was that she was not facing a species. She was facing 10,000 years of accumulated warfare knowledge. On Earth, the 3 weeks had been spent preparing. Every military academy on the planet ran continuous war games. They simulated every possible attack pattern. They tested every possible defense. They learned from every mistake. Intelligence agencies pooled their data. Scientists worked around the clock studying the alien technology. They could not replicate it, but they could understand its principles. They knew how the ships moved. They knew how the shields worked. They knew where the weak points might be. And soldiers drilled in bases across every continent. Armies trained with an intensity never seen before. Sleep became optional. Comfort became irrelevant. Every soldier, every sailor, every pilot practiced their role until they could perform it without thinking. Fire teams moved as single units. Squadrons flew as single organisms. Entire armies operated as extensions of a single will. The humans had something the Valorians had never developed. They had military tradition. They had doctrine. They had thousands of years of lessons written in blood and passed down through generations. The Valorians had never needed tactics. They had always won through overwhelming technological superiority. They pointed their weapons and fired. The enemy died. It was simple. Humans had never had that luxury. They had always fought enemies who were roughly equal to them. Sometimes they fought enemies who were stronger. They had learned to win through cleverness, through discipline, through willingness to sacrifice. They had turned warfare into something almost beautiful in its terrible complexity. General Chun stood in her command center and watched the alien fleet approach. 40 dreadnoughts. Each one was larger than an aircraft carrier. Each one carried weapons that could level cities in seconds. She felt fear. Of course, she felt fear. Only a fool would not be afraid. But she had a plan. The humans had studied the first engagement carefully. They understood now that they could not fight the hegemony directly. Their shields were too strong. Their weapons were too powerful. A straight fight would end in human extinction, so they would not fight a straight fight. Across the solar system, surprises waited. Automated probes had been launched in the weeks since the first battle. They carried special packages to special places. The moon was seeded with nuclear devices. Asteroids had been nudged into new orbits. Empty fuel tanks had been scattered along the paths the alien fleet would likely use. On Earth, every submarine had been deployed. Every aircraft was ready. Every missile was aimed, and on small stations scattered across the planet, something special was waiting. Modified aircraft. Fighters that had been stripped of everything non-essential and fitted with sealed cockpits and emergency oxygen supplies. They were not meant to fight in space. They were not meant to survive, but they were meant to kill. Volunteer pilots sat in those cockpits. They knew what they were being asked to do. They knew they would not come back. They had volunteered anyway. That was the thing about humans that the Valorians could never understand. They were mortal. They knew they would die. And somehow, that knowledge made them more dangerous. Not less. Fleet. Commander Yethkarai watched her fleet enter the human solar system. Her ships moved in perfect formation. Her weapons were charged. Her officers were ready. She expected resistance. She expected tricks. She was prepared for anything the primitives might try. She was not prepared for silence. As her fleet approached Earth, the planet went dark. No radio transmissions. No communication signals. No activity visible on any frequency. The humans had simply stopped talking. Yethkarai felt a small tremor of unease. This was not normal behavior for a doomed species. They should be panicking. They should be trying to negotiate. They should be doing something. Instead, they waited. Her tactical officer reported everything looked normal. Scans showed human military forces in position around the globe. Ships floated in their oceans. Aircraft sat on their runways. Everything was ready, but nothing moved. Nothing spoke. The entire planet seemed to be holding its breath. Yethkarai gave the order to begin the approach. Her fleet moved toward Earth in perfect formation. They had done this 1,000 times before. They knew exactly what to do. The trap closed when they crossed the orbit of the human moon. General Chun watched the alien fleet pass. The trigger point. She picked up her communicator and spoke a single word. Now. On the moon. In the asteroids, in the scattered debris fields, devices activated. On Earth, missiles launched. In orbit, satellites that had seemed dead suddenly came alive. The weight of 10,000 years fell upon the hegemony fleet. And humanity went to war. The first explosions came from below. Nuclear devices buried in lunar regolith detonated in a precise sequence. The blasts were not meant to damage ships directly. They were meant to create chaos. Millions of tons of moon rock became shrapnel, flying outward in an expanding cloud of death. Fleet. Commander Yethkarai watched her tactical display light up with warnings. Her formation, perfect moments ago, suddenly needed to move. Ships that had been traveling in straight lines now had to dodge and weave. Through a storm of debris, some of her cruisers were too slow. The Valorian shields could stop directed energy weapons. They could deflect plasma and laser fire. But they struggled against millions of small rocks, traveling at incredible speeds. 3 cruisers lost their shields in the first minute. 2 more lost their engines. Before Yethkarai could issue orders. The second attack came. From beneath Earth's oceans, submarines launched their payloads. These were not ordinary nuclear missiles. They had been modified. The warheads had been removed and replaced with something simpler. Canisters filled with tungsten spheres. The missiles climbed out of atmosphere and exploded in calculated patterns. Each explosion scattered thousands of metal balls into the paths of the alien ships. At the speeds involved, even a tiny sphere became a devastating weapon. Yethkarai's cruisers took the worst of it. Shields flickered and died. Hulls were punctured by dozens of impacts. Atmosphere vented into space. Crew died without understanding what had killed them. She ordered her fleet to scatter. It was the worst possible command, but she had no choice. Staying in formation meant dying together. At least if they separated, some might survive. That was exactly what the humans wanted. As the Valorian fleet broke apart, a third attack began. From bases across Earth, modified aircraft launched. They climbed through the atmosphere on pillars of fire, their pilots pushing engines beyond safe limits. These were not normal aircraft. They had been stripped of everything non-essential. Landing gear was gone. Ejection systems were gone. Everything that added weight but was not absolutely necessary had been removed. In their place. Each aircraft carried a single weapon, a nuclear device shaped and focused to direct its energy in a narrow cone. A lance of pure destruction that could punch through shields. If it got close enough, the pilots knew what they were being asked to do. They knew their aircraft were not designed for space. They knew their oxygen would run out eventually. They knew they would not be coming home. They flew anyway. Lieutenant James Okonkwo had been a fighter pilot for 12 years. He had flown combat missions over 3 continents. He had never expected to die in space. His aircraft shook as it left atmosphere. Warning lights covered his dashboard. His engine was overheating. His life support was failing. None of that mattered. Through his canopy, he could see the alien ships. They were beautiful in a terrible way. Huge vessels of curves and light, dancing through space like living things. He had studied them for weeks. He knew their weak points. The shields were strongest at the front and top. They were weakest at the engine sections. If he could get close enough, if he could hit the right spot, his weapon would burn through. He pushed his throttle forward. His aircraft screamed in protest. He ignored it. Other pilots flew beside him. He could see their aircraft, tiny sparks of humanity against the vast darkness. They were all going to the same place. They were all going to the same end. One of the alien cruisers turned toward them. Its weapons fired. Lieutenant Chun, who had been flying on his right, disappeared in a flash of light. Lieutenant Petrova, on his left, managed to dodge the first shot but not the second. Okonkwo did not more. There was no time. He could see his target now. A dreadnought, 3 times the size of an aircraft carrier. Its shields flickered from earlier impacts. He aimed for the engine section. He armed his weapon. He whispered a prayer to gods he was not sure he believed in. Then he flew directly into the alien ship. The shaped nuclear charge detonated at the moment of impact. The focused energy lance punched through weakened shields. The dreadnought's engine section exploded outward. Secondary detonations rippled through the vessel. Within seconds, one of the mightiest ships in the hegemony fleet was dead. Across the battle space, similar stories played out. Human pilots died by the hundreds. But they took alien ships with them. Cruisers fell. Dreadnoughts burned. The impossible was happening. Fleet Commander Yethkarai watched her fleet die around her. In 11 minutes, she lost 6 dreadnoughts. 6 of the most powerful warships ever built, destroyed by primitives in aircraft that should not have been able to reach orbit. She tried to understand what she was seeing. The humans were killing themselves to kill her ships. They were trading their lives for hers. It was madness. It was suicide. It was completely against every principle of rational warfare, and it was working. Her tactical officer reported that they had lost almost half their cruisers. Her weapons officer reported that human missiles were still coming. Her communications officer reported that more aircraft were launching from Earth. Yethkarai realized something terrible. The humans were not trying to win. They were trying to make the cost of victory so high that the hegemony would not want to pay it. They were willing to sacrifice everything. Their pilots, their weapons, their very lives. They would drag the hegemony fleet into the grave with them if they had to. She had conquered hundreds of worlds. She had never seen anything like this. For the first time in her long career, Fleet Commander HFY gave an order she had never given before. Retreat. The surviving ships of the 3rd Expeditionary Force turned and ran. They left their dead behind. They left their pride behind. They ran from a planet of primitives who had done what no species in hegemony history had ever done. They had fought back, and they had won. The Valorian 3rd Expeditionary Force retreated in silence. Of 40 dreadnoughts, only 19 remained operational. Of 200 cruisers, fewer than 70 survived. The flagship limped toward the nearest relay point, trailing atmosphere and debris. Fleet Commander HFY sat alone in her quarters and composed a report. Her hands trembled as she wrote. She had served the hegemony for 400 years. She had conquered 53 worlds. She had never known defeat. Now she knew. She documented everything. The tactics the humans had used. The weapons they had deployed. The terrible willingness to sacrifice their own lives. She included recordings from the battle, showing the tiny aircraft flying directly into her ships. She included the last transmissions from dying cruisers, their crews screaming in confusion as nuclear fire consumed them. And at the end, she added a recommendation that would change the course of galactic history. Reclassify species 7421 Gamma. Threat assessment. Existential. Recommend immediate quarantine of their system. No further contact. No engagement under any circumstances. On Earth, there was no celebration. The cost had been too high for that. General Chun stood on a beach in California and watched the sun set over the Pacific. The sky was still strange. Debris from the battle caught the light in unusual ways. The moon had new craters visible even with naked eyes. She thought about the pilots who had not come home. Thousands of them. Men and women who had climbed into aircraft knowing they would die. They had done it anyway. They had done it without hesitation. Okonkwo, Petrova, Chun, Martinez, Kowalski, Yamamoto. The names went on and on. She had read everyone. She would remember everyone. Across the planet, cities were still standing. Families were still whole. Children were still laughing. The aliens had wanted to take all of that away. They had wanted to turn humanity into slaves. They had failed. In the months that followed, the nations of Earth began a project that would consume generations. They had seen what waited in the darkness between stars. They had learned that they were not alone and that not everyone out there was friendly. They would not be caught unprepared again. Factories that had once built consumer goods now built warships. Scientists who had once competed for funding now worked together on classified projects. Resources flowed freely between nations that had once been rivals. The old divisions did not disappear entirely. Humans were still humans. They still argued. They still disagreed. They still had conflicts. But when they looked up at the stars, they remembered what they had faced together. They remembered the price they had paid. And they put aside their differences long enough to prepare for the next battle. Somewhere out in the galaxy, the Valorian hegemony received HFY's report. The High Council read it in stunned silence. They had ruled the galaxy for 8,000 years. They had conquered 12,000 species. No one had ever made them retreat. They debated for weeks. Some wanted to send a larger fleet. Some wanted to use planet-killer weapons. Some wanted to simply ignore the report and pretend it had never happened. In the end, they chose caution. They added a warning to humanity's file in their species database. A warning that would persist long after their empire crumbled to dust. The mortals of the 3rd planet do not surrender. They do not negotiate under threat. When presented with aggression, they respond not with fear, but with the disciplined fury of a species that has spent its entire existence preparing for war. Avoid at all costs, other civilizations intercepted this warning. Travelers and traders and explorers who passed through hegemony space heard rumors of the impossible. A primitive species had defeated the mighty Valorians. A world of short-lived creatures had made an empire retreat. They studied this information. They analyzed it. And slowly, across the galaxy, species began to fear the quiet little world that had taught an empire to run. On that world, humans continued their lives. They fell in love. They raised children. They built things and broke things and dreamed of better futures. They were fragile creatures. Their lives were short. Their bodies were weak. But when threatened, they became something else entirely. General Chun retired 5 years after the battle. She moved to a small town in the mountains and tried to forget about war. She could not, of course. The memories were too strong. The faces of the dead visited her in dreams, but on clear nights she would walk outside and look up at the stars. She would remember the fear. She would remember the sacrifice. And she would remember the moment when humanity stood together against the darkness and refused to break. They had won. Not because they were stronger. Not because they were smarter. Not because they had better technology. They had won because they had something the hegemony had never understood. They had will. They had discipline. They had a willingness to fight for each other that transcended all their differences. The aliens had called them mortals. They had meant it as an insult, but mortality was not weakness. It was strength. Knowing that life was short made every moment precious. Knowing that death was real made every cause worth dying for. The hegemony had forgotten these lessons long ago. They had become immortal and infinite and invincible. And in their invincibility, they had lost the fire that made victory possible. Humans had never lost that fire. They carried it with them through every generation. From the first cave paintings to the first nuclear weapons to the first battle among the stars, when the hegemony asked them to kneel, they had responded with everything they had, and the galaxy would never forget it. On Earth, children grew up hearing stories of the brave pilots who had saved the world. They played games where they fought imaginary aliens. They dreamed of becoming heroes, and somewhere in the vast darkness between the stars, other eyes watched and waited. The humans had announced themselves to the universe, and the universe was paying attention.